Jim, how you doing today?
Doing good. How are you?
Good. Thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. I know you're extremely busy man.
I think lots of folks are busy these days, so not a problem.
Yeah, that's true. Well, get right to it. My first question is what was your childhood like? And was any of that a seed of that kind of was planted that gets you to what you're doing today?
Good question. I think I had an interesting childhood and not unlike others. Um, it was not a storybook childhood.
Hmm.
I was divorced when I was very young. I was raised in part by my grandparents for a few years until my mom remarried. I am that being raised by my grandparents, I think, gave me a different perspective than I might have otherwise had if my initial memories and my growing up had been anything but that of a generation that was older. In some ways, I'm a step out of time with my own generation. I can understand and relate more to people in the past. And as a child, I was fascinated by history and by talking to folks about what had been. And that fascination ultimately led to archaeology, but it also, I think, made me more open to learning and
Hmm.
talking to others. And in a funny way, growing up in California at a time when it was changing and evolving from an older agricultural California into, well, in my case, I grew up in San Jose. It was orchards and hay farms and horses and buggies and
Hmm.
then cars, but all of a sudden it became Silicon Valley. And I remember that older California. My earliest work was interviewing pioneers who had been born in the 19th century
Wow.
and learning how to ride horse, going out with the descendants of those early families and roping and branding and earmarking and all of that which goes with a rodeo, a roundup.
Hmm.
So early on, an interest in the past, not being afraid to ask questions and talking to older people, but also a fascination with what was and also having this hands-on appreciation. You fast forward that to my career as an archaeologist, and that certainly got translated from the saddle to the quarterdeck and being on the ship.
Hmm. Was Jules Verne an influence on you as a kid?
Jules Verne was an influence, but so too were the tales of Sinbad and
Sure.
other great stories. My grandparents encouraged reading, and I was fortunate enough that I learned to read at an early age. By the time I was 3, I was reading, and my grandmother
Wow.
see me reading the newspaper. I loved it. When I was in school, in grade school, at age 10, studying Egypt and Rome and Greece, I went to the library and they wanted to check out children's books, but I said no. And I ended up being able to, with the librarians saying yes and signing for me, I was able to get the books for older readers.
Hmm.
And so it was those tales that fascinated me. It was reading Stevens talking about cutting his way through Mayan jungles at 12, as
Hmm.
as Sinbad, and not just the fantastic, but the reality of what lay behind the Sinbad voyages with Islamic seafarers.
Hmm.
So there was all of that. Jules Verne, of course,
Hmm.
but at that stage I was more fascinated with digging things out of the ground than I
Hmm.
was digging things in the sea. And all of that changed in 1978 when, in my initial posting to San Francisco as a National Park Service historian, they had a buried ship blocks away from the sea next to the Transamerica Pyramid, deposited there in the mud, and ultimately filled around to become a building. The ship Niantic had arrived in July of 1849 and never left, burned to the waterline and covered over along with dozens of other ships. That was the moment in which I shifted from earlier California history and pre
Hmm.
and ancient civilizations to my love of the sea.
Hmm.
Now, I also grew up with grandparents on both sides who had boats. I fished, went out on the water, went out in the ocean, and certainly did a lot of lake fishing as well as water skiing with my other grandparents. So I was
Hmm.
all water baby.
You said that you learned to dive at the Helen Keller School of Diving. What did you mean by that?
Well, when I was in the Park Service and I wanted to start learning to dive, the only place to go to do that was the 6th Army at the Presidio San Francisco at a dive school.
Mm-hmm.
So with the park archaeologist, Martin Mayer, we went off and we went through this dive school led by Master Sergeant Dutch Bowen. Loved it. It was not easy, but anytime when you're being trained to dive and they try their level best to kill you, and exaggerating a little, the point is that they put us through all sorts of scenarios, as did the Park Service, so that you would become a more competent diver by having enough confidence, but not too much.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that was working and diving in San Francisco Bay, where you couldn't hear a thing, you couldn't see a thing. Hence, we called it the Helen Keller School of Diving, unlike poor Miss Keller, who could neither see nor hear. She could sign. We would just have to squeeze each other. The arm squeezes or tug on the rope meant this way. Kind of. The mud coming through the Golden Gate. Out the Golden Gate, I guess. It was just, you couldn't see your hand in front of your face.
Wow. Yeah, that's initiation by fire right there. So then what was it like then going from San Francisco Bay to a place, say, in the Caribbean, where you just could see so far? Was it easier? Was it more interesting? What was that transition like?
Well, for years, the work was all low vis.
Mm-hmm.
So, it wasn't until I would get up into, say, the North Coast. I didn't do much work in the Caribbean initially, nor the Med. My work was Pacific Coast, Atlantic Coast, and then finally the North Pacific Coast, and then up into the Arctic. And there, it's all of the world. You're dealing with cold, but you've got clarity. And the emerald seas off British Columbia were just magic. You're in these massive cathedrals of water with a wreck below you, and you can see down to it. And that was amazing. To going out into the Pacific, again, in something like Bikini, where we were diving on the ship sunk in the A-bomb test, you could see a few hundred feet ahead. That was very, very different indeed. I'm glad I had the experience I did, though, because gave me the perspective of, I think if I'd started with diving being easy, swimming pools or warm water with clarity, it wouldn't have prepared me for some of the work that I would do later.
Right. Now, you shot 6 seasons of Sea Hunters for National Geographic. Amazing show, by the way. What were some of your favorite episodes?
Any episode that we did where we had the opportunity, as we did with many of them, to showcase the work of other colleagues around the world was a good day on the job, because people were doing incredible stuff all over, and to share stories with a global audience that introduced them to a wreck in the Baltic, or to a submarine in Panama, to the Japanese excavating the wrecks from Kublai Khan's invasion that inspired the legend of the kamikaze, to wrecks in Chile, going to the tip of South America. I mean, all of these places, diving a Nazi concentration camp under a mountain that's flooded. All of those stories were powerful, but in each one of those cases and others, we were able to work with our colleagues and showcase what they were doing and be the ones that, as the guides would say, come take a look. And so the audience was able to participate literally over our shoulder. And it fun. It was a privilege. And, for all the work I've done in documentaries, usually, you'll do a one-off or show on this, show on that. The idea of a series is fascinating because you can develop themes. You can start working in different directions. And in that, we were able to move from, of course, here we are associated with Clive Cussler. So it's got to be an iconic ship with a fascinating story. But we were able to segue that into fascinating stories because of the science being done, or what the archaeology would reveal, or because here's the story behind the myth of something like, say, the kamikaze, or to look at something profound and not just have an adventure diving show, but a thoughtful show where we're interviewing concentration camp survivors and making the point that in those tunnels underneath the Harz Mountains at Dora Mittelbau, 20,000 people died as enslaved labor building these V1s and V2s for Hitler. That meant a great deal. And so the series had a profound impact. And when the time came to pick up the series banner again, and we've just concluded filming season 4 of Drain the Oceans, again, it's the idea of showcasing stories and the work of others and getting people's attention focused on different issues, not just here's an iconic famous ship, but here's a story you may not have heard, but it's cool and it's important.
Wow. Now, I realize how much time goes into every episode. I've had a show myself. How many hours of work average you think it took per episode to produce that?
Well, with Sea Hunters, not only was I the host, but I was actually going out there and oftentimes being the archaeologist. When we were in Greenland, I was the guy who had the permit to do the mapping and the documentation of the ice-shaved half of the Fox, for example. I can't even begin to estimate the number of hours that went into that. Plus, as anybody who's worked in television or in film knows, just the simple act of getting this on camera means that it's 20 times of, okay, let's just have the hand come up and go down, the hand come up and go down. Okay, now we're going to cut from this angle. And
the wide shot, the close shot.
Yeah, so I mean, my daughter at one stage had wanted to go into acting, and I had her come along on a couple of shoots. But then I had friends who were Hollywood actors, and they had their own series they were doing. And they took Beth aside and they said, this is the reality. You have a day job and you're waiting on tables, or you're parking cars, as Dionne Warwick would famously sing in Do You Know the Way to San Jose? Or pumping gas, I guess was the other. But they said, this is the reality. And it's watching paint dry is akin to making a movie or making a show. So, yeah, I mean, I can't even begin to calculate the number of hours. But coming out of that, I would then work to write up a report, follow it up with some real hard science, or, ultimately capture it and put it into a book.
But tell me a bit about Drain the Oceans. That was extremely interesting.
When Drain the Oceans started, Crispin Sadler, the producer with Mallinson Sadler Productions, had been asked by National Geographic to take the concept, and they started by draining the Great Lakes. And then it was Drain Titanic, and that's where I met Crispin. Having been out there and been on Titanic a few times. And then came this sense of, okay, now let's do some what-offs. Let's drain World War II. Let's drain the Bermuda Triangle. And so out of that ultimately came the series. And with that, there's no host for the show. There's a few of us who regularly show up. My job, though, in addition to that, is series senior advisor. So I help determine not only what the shows might be, what they'll look like, but be the one who introduces the show to colleagues, brings them into the mix. And that's fun, because the one thing that I saw, and it oftentimes I think happens a great deal in television, is people get so hooked on seeing themselves or feel that, that's where it's at. I don't know all of the answers. I don't know all these stories. I have a understanding of many of them. And as I once said, yes, I have an ocean of knowledge, but that ocean is about 1/4 of an inch thick. Getting your colleagues to really know that's their focus. That's been wonderful. And seeing them step up and realize that not only do they have an opportunity to show their knowledge, but to also show their passion for the subject, and that's not a bad thing. And that some of them are just natural born communicators. It's wonderful.
Right. Now, what percentage of the ocean floor currently is unexplored?
It used to be 95%. I think we've explored over 10%. I think we're getting to the stage where in the next 10 years, we're going to probably be approaching half.
Mhm.
Technology's catching. And with that, let's just say what that means. By 2030, the plan is to have have the seabeds mapped.
Mhm.
Mapped, though, is a very different thing. And you can look at a big map of all of Manhattan, but do you know that neighborhood that has that restaurant? No. Do you know this mountain pass in an area? No. Do you know this museum that sits there? No. You have to get into that level of detail. And so therein lies, I think, the next frontier in exploration. The mapping is important, but in the oceans, what's also going to be important is that which sits on the bottom, but also the life that exists in the ocean itself. Many of us for years used to think of it as just part of the commute, and you zone out as much as you might on the subway train or in the back of a car in a carpool. But the reality is that it's full of life, whether it's synthetic, whether it's not really visible, but there it is, whether it's microscopic or big, there it is. And then there's everything buried in a seemingly lifeless desert. The real mysteries of life, new species, it's all down there, as is this incredible vault of history, human history, that has come to rest on the seabed. While most of those wrecks are more modern, from the last 300-400 years, and many of them date to the last two world wars, there is this spread of it, particularly when you consider sea level rise and how much of the ancient world that our ancestors knew, hunting animals that we can't even imagine now because they're extinct, like megasloths and mastodon. Their world is drowned now. It's up to 300 feet deep. And so that's all down there. And so what I like to say, particularly to students or to anybody that's a lifelong learner, no matter how old you are, here it is. Here's the true final frontier. You can join us on a voyage into inner space, the final frontier, to boldly go where few or none have gone before, to seek out new life, as well as find evidence of our own civilization. So therein lies the fun of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, give it a little more time. We're going to learn more, but it's going to be a steep learning curve. And then there's a lot of detail that's going to have to be sussed out. We're going to have to figure it out. We're going to have to go down there and continue to look at it. And as much as I wanted to be an astronaut, I'm far more content these days in being an aquanaut.
Now, how closely related do you believe is being a marine archaeologist and being a marine biologist? Because I'm sure while you're down there, you see so much, and so do you feel they're interwoven?
You do. I mean, it's a whole other world. And what you're seeing is human history through the filter, if you will, not just of water, but of biological colonization and change. But the beauty of it is that as much as we would often look back in the old television shows and there would be Captain Cousteau, and with that voice, tell you everything that you're seeing on television. I remember being fascinated. But I can assure you that none of us, really, we don't know it all. And particularly when you said that marine archaeologists and marine biologists both go to school for a long time and study in very different ways. Some of us are more science-minded than humanities-minded. And I'm sure many, of the hard science folks, the ones that are doing, ocean chemistry or marine biology or the rest would say, oh, well, here we go. Your PhD in humanities versus my two MIT PhDs in building robotic systems to withstand 6,000 PSI. And I get that. The point I want to make is that everybody works together. It's a team. And so these days, particularly with telepresence missions, where we're looking at it like this, and everybody has a chance to chime in and to help direct the mission. That's when the biologist says, I really need to look at that. And I say, okay, when we're done with that, that artifact is going to tell us something. And somebody else says, well, look what just crawled into a little mud hole. And somebody else is reading the instrumentation saying, the dissolved oxygen levels here are amazing. And the geologist is saying, you think that's cool? Look over there. That's a tar volcano. So that kind of dynamic particularly is powerful. And it comes back to a point that I get as somebody that follows the sea. All of us who are working down there, all of us who are working in the oceans, we're not competing with each other for airtime on the robotic systems or the rest. We work together, and we work in the same way that lighthouses work together. Lighthouses don't compete with one another. Lighthouses work together to show you a path.
Nice. Now, right off the coast of Cape Cod, years back, I believe, was a very, very busy shipping channel, really the busiest until the English Channel was built. Is that an area of interest for you?
Yes, I mean, and the only reason I hesitated is because I've got a list of areas of interest like here.
I get it.
It's a big ocean, and all these stories are fascinating. My research focus, rather than being geographical, has always been the origins of the world we live in today and the role of the sea in that. So the modern world of the last 5 centuries, which is an increasingly global society and a global economy prior to the internet and prior to airplanes, has been where I go. It's the start of the industrial age. It is the start of connections. It's the best and the worst of human experience, because this is the era in which the international slave trade blossoms. This is a period in which the industrial age will work people over so badly that you have poor farms in England, and French workers worked too hard will take their wooden shoes off and throw them into the gears of the machinery, and hence that wooden sabot or shoe becomes an act of sabotage. I mean, all of that is what fascinates me, because the world you and I live in was born then, and in many ways, while we have different tech, we're still those people.
Now, when someone finds treasure on a shipwreck, who gets to keep it? What are the laws with that when you discover treasure?
Well, that's a complicated story, because in the past it used to be finders keepers, but then, of course, practically everything has an owner, right? And just because something's on the bottom of the sea doesn't mean that those ownership rights go away. And so I've seen insurance companies and others step in. Governments will step in, particularly if it's a war grave. But what I'd like to think is that what really needs to be looked at is what's important about that wreck, and what is its best use, its best purpose. If you've got a modern wreck from World War II sitting down there with a bunch of gold bars that belonged to Stalin that now need to go back into the flow of commerce, as they did in the 1980s when the the British government and the Soviets came to a deal to get into the HMS Edinburgh and respectfully cut through that war grave and get that gold out, that was not a bad thing. If you were looking at a wreck that is an incredibly powerful site to dive, and it's helping the tourist economy, like the Mary Celestia in Bermuda that everybody loves to dive on, or the NOAA next to the wreck of the Constellation, which is so compelling a set of dives with one wreck here and the other here that it would inspire Peter Benchley to write The Deep. Should somebody be allowed to come along and just cut that up for scrap because they can make more money on the iron? No, because it has this other value. And not just to the divers who snorkel it or scuba it, but to the people who take photographs of it and sell the postcards. Therein lies a better use. Is there another wreck that is sitting down there, and it doesn't need to be archaeologically excavated and raised and recovered, because poking around those iron bones are all sorts of fish that people can sport fish off of. But by the same token, should somebody be allowed to come through with a big, heavy trawl and smash it all to pieces so they got the fish, but nobody else will? That's where I come down to this idea of thinking responsibly about what's down there and what is in the best interests of society as determined by society, not just an expert saying, well, I think it's this or that. You have a say. You can say, I think it's for this or that. I mean, we're looking right now at science which is looking at drowned forests off the coast of Alabama and determining that the processes in there will ultimately give us the next generation of infection fighting medicines, as opposed to antibiotics, which are running out of they're running out of time for being useful. And so this other tech coming out of that aspect of marine science means that somebody shouldn't be allowed to come along and just trawl away that ancient forest now being exposed as the mud erodes, or to start cutting off pieces and selling it as souvenirs on the beach.
Right.
So just thoughtful, thinking carefully, and as always, I mean, in life in general, you try to walk softly. You don't want to leave footprints everywhere, particularly on other people's faces.
Yeah, good point. Very good point. What are the oldest wreckages that we can find today? Are there any from the era of the first ships, or is kind of the ocean eating those away?
We still don't have much of an understanding through actually looking at things that date back to when humanity first started spreading around by the sea. And by that, I mean 50,000 to 35,000 years ago. I think what's increasingly becoming clear is that our ancestors were not stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, they're us, right? They're capable of being dumb as well as being incredibly smart. They can adapt to technology. I personally believe, based on discussions with colleagues and what we are looking at, that the earliest craft were probably not very different from a whole Polynesian voyaging canoe. You certainly see with early depictions of ships in the Mediterranean 9,000 years ago, that's sort of where it's at, particularly when you go to Santorini and you look at the frescoes on the wall at the Akrotiri site. That's what we're looking at, but I think that's late. The most successful kind of voyaging we know of is the Polynesians spreading out across the Pacific. That type of boat with an outrigger is just smart, and it's efficient, and it's good enough to have had Polynesians, so the Lapita culture and others spreading throughout the Pacific, and not just a bunch of warriors in a canoe, but pregnant women, small children, household pets, livestock, and taro, which is notoriously susceptible to being killed if it's doused in salt water or even hit with a heavy spray. And that plant goes everywhere in these canoes. So I think we haven't found that. The earliest depictions we're seeing of ships go back several thousand years, but the oldest wreck we've actually ever been able to see as archaeologists is only about 3,300 to 3,500 years old. And those are two sites off the coast of Turkey, three sites actually, a more recently excavated one, and then the Uluburun and the Galadonia ships excavated in Turkey by George Bass, Honor Frost, Joan de Platte Taylor, Peter Throckmorton, and others, 1960, and then again in the 80s and into the early 90s. And those are ships, by way of explanation. In the case of the Uluburun wreck, King Tut is likely on the throne when that ship sinks. That's relatively recent in Egyptian dynastic history. I mean, we're talking, 18th, moving into the 19th dynasty.
What areas of the world best preserve wrecks, and why? Is it low oxygen level, or?
I think the answer is there's different places and different environments that do preserve wrecks. The few things that help, one, it's going to be low oxygen levels. Mm-hmm. See, in the deep, some shipwrecks with very low oxygen levels remain remarkably well preserved. I mean, the most recent dives by Victor Vescovo onto the USS Johnston, the deepest wreck yet found, I mean, she's still painted, and the paint is scorched from that battle with Japanese ships in World War II. And we're 8 decades out. And yet it looks as if it sank yesterday. In time, that will change. We see wooden shipwrecks in the Baltic that, because of the low salinity, don't have the Teredo nivalis. And so those termites of the sea don't eat that wood. The Black Sea as well, you see that. In the Arctic and the subarctic, you see it. But as climate change continues, and as humanity, now that we're in the Anthropocene, has shifted from being influenced by the oceans and by weather to influencing the oceans and the weather with our own actions, those places are going. I would say this, that, and particularly because my own career started there with a ship like this, is the other place you see it is the deep oceans of frontier, but also landfill. every great port city. And for me, studying, that the more modern history, thanks to landfill, there are very well preserved ships from the California Gold Rush underneath San Francisco, which is where I started. Ships from the Dutch era all the way through to the 19th century buried beneath the Manhattan riverfront. In Marseille, Greek ships. In Oslo, Viking ships. In Antwerp, Renaissance ships. Roman riverine warships in the banks of the river and Mainz. Buried ships in Buenos Aires. Buried ships in Seattle. Buried Roman wrecks in Pisa, and so on. And so, and when you consider that there are places that we've yet to really look at that are now changed, while we've had areas submerged by change over time, other areas have become dry. The beach that the Greeks landed on and fought the Trojans upon are now a tomato field just outside the walls of Troy. And yet, in that ancient harbor of Troy, I would imagine there will be very well preserved things. We see this with an excavation done in Istanbul. We're at Yenikapı when they were putting in the train station, and had a chance to go see this as it was being excavated. You're peeling back the layers of history to the Chalcolithic, but you're also seeing well-preserved wooden ships, some of them sunk by a tsunami that are still loaded with cargo. But Galea, road warships that we'd only seen depictions of in pottery or in a wall painting, now they're three-dimensionally so intact, so well-preserved that you can see the scuff marks where men dug their heels in as they tugged at those oars to get that warship going.
Wow.
So all sorts of things preserve ships. The number one factor in not preserving ships is what we do by trawling, by rapidly tearing through waterfronts to redevelop without thinking of all the history that's gone by the by. You can't save everything, but at least you can carefully look at it and document it so that you've at least made a photocopy of the page of that book, that one copy of that book, the only edition ever published, that if you don't, you just have pages torn out and burned and you'll never know exactly what was in them.
Mm-hmm. Now, what's more important to marine archaeology? Let me rephrase it. What's more important to marine archaeology is the age of the wreck or the cargo that's within it?
The real driver for me is what I can learn through a wreck about what's going on, about what people are thinking, what they're doing, what's happening in a society. And that can be not just, say, understanding what happened with life on board this vessel, but with ancient wrecks, the complex trade routes and relationships. To point, the Uluburun wreck, when excavated, had cargo and goods from 12 separate cultures that ranged from the Baltic before they were Vikings to equatorial Africa to the Levant throughout the Mediterranean. In other words, a global economy for these people long before we ever came up with a more European-driven global economy. For me as well, it might not be that it's the details of construction, but in the case of an early submarine that we were looking at and documenting in Panama, it was the realization, that we can be clever, we can build incredible technology and equipment, but we're not always fully aware of or mindful of the peril that can come. And in this case, this sub was built magnificently. It was a successful craft that was able to go deep and under pressure under the water with pressurized air chambers, flood its main control compartment so that you matched the sea pressure outside and you can open the hatch at the bottom and reach something up from the bottom of the sea. A diving bell in its own way, an automobile diving bell. And it was brilliant. It worked, except for one thing. They had yet to figure out what happens when you go down for hours and your body is under that kind of pressure. And then you close the hatch and you pop up to the surface and you let all that pressure off and you step out. Anybody that dives knows that that gives you the bends, and it can hurt, it can cripple, it can kill. And that's what happened here. So as Prometheus found, as Dr. Frankenstein found, as anybody that's ever seen Jeff Goldblum in The Fly has seen, things can go terribly wrong when you invent something or you play with something without really being aware of the risks or what you have wrought. And so that's important. I mean, particularly as we continually let the genie out of the bottle. We've cracked the atom, we've cracked code, we're rewriting DNA, we are able to grow things in laboratories. And science fiction, as well as more contemporary fiction, is full of dystopian futures in which that sort of thing went terribly wrong. And so for me as an archaeologist, looking at a site where you can go, oh yeah, in this case, not only did the crew all get the bends and the sub was ultimately abandoned, but they also used it to non-sustainably harvest the pearls in Panama's Islas de las Perlas and wiped out an industry that has yet to recover. It had been sustainable when people would hold their breath and dive. It was a more human scaled activity and pearls were valuable, but then people get greedy and they begin to industrialize and you create a craft that can get, but once you vacuumed it all up, yeah, you and your investors, you've done okay. But everybody else, particularly the people left behind, the people that have done this work for generations, have nothing left. And so therein lies one of the reasons why I do my archaeology is you can see, even if not everything's been written down, there are things that still will come across.
What was the oldest wreck that you've ever been involved with?
Roman period, the Mediterranean, tagging along with friends and their projects, working off the coast of Albania. I guess it's a Greek wreck. It's about 4th century BC. On that was fascinating. On a ledge off the coast of Albania near Saranda, a Roman wreck close by that nobody had dived on. The Enver Hoxha, the communist dictator of Albania, wouldn't let anybody out on the water. So the wrecks were not really been touched and there hadn't been any fishing, so they hadn't been trawled away. I remember coming onto this Roman wreck with all the amphora stacked up neatly. And at the stern, even though the wood was gone, there was all the tableware, including the little wine pot that the crew had for their own meals.
Wow.
That was about 3rd century AD, North African Roman colony.
How important to this field was Don Casimir's work?
Cas and the work that he did with the Ben Franklin, I think, is another important step in our becoming increasingly aware of the oceans. And I'm glad you brought Cas up, because Casimir and so many others who were out there coming out of the military or working in the industry did a fair amount to advance where we would go in inner space, while at the same time we're looking at outer space. And for anybody that's not familiar with what Don Casimir did, as a former Navy submariner, Cas was selected to be the captain of the PX-15 Ben Franklin, a mesoscaphe submersible designed by Jacques Piccard and used in a famous drift mission in 1969 that would go from West Palm all the way up to the coast of Newfoundland, drifting in the mid-ocean current, observing life. And yes, it was painted yellow as well as white, with Erwin Abersold, who was from Bureau Piccard, with Jacques himself, with Chet May from NASA. Von Braun paid to have Chet on board and had cameras everywhere. They took over 50,000 images to see how astronauts would do in enclosed quarters for a month, which is what they sealed these guys in for as they drifted in the Gulf Stream. Ken May. These guys just did incredible work, but it's largely been forgotten, because while they were drifting and on this incredible mission into inner space, Apollo 11 landed on the moon. And so there you go. Ben Franklin is what they named it, because Ben Franklin was the first scientist to say there's a Gulf Stream. Ended up being dismantled and ended up in a back lot of Vancouver shipyards in British Columbia, where I spotted it thanks to a member of my board at the Maritime Museum, where I was director, and we rescued Ben Franklin, thanks to Dahl and all of his hard work as a trustee. We got it delivered. We put it back together. I spent a few years working on it. Whenever you get tired of your desk job being a museum director, it's awesome to be able to put on a battered pair of jeans and coveralls and go out and scrape paint or rewire or bolt on big heavy pieces of steel with a crane. It was fun.
Sure.
But it also was an opportunity to bring back this submarine, this submersible from near death. And we organized and had a wonderful reunion. Jacques couldn't make it. He was still alive, but his health precluded him coming. But Bertrand Piccard came out. We had a wonderful opportunity, and we did a video conference with Jacques where everybody was there, Kaz and Erwin and Chet. And yeah, it was fun. It was fun.
That's beautiful.
That kind of work was absolutely essential because it was part of getting us as Americans, as people around the world, getting us into inner space and learning more about the oceans. And what I think was particularly visionary was it wasn't just used to commute to get to the bottom. It was drifting in the Gulf Stream and seeing what was out there.
Mm-hmm.
Bought a series, he had a tape recorder, and he had a series of tapes that they would play. And I said, well, and he goes, well, of course we had Yellow Submarine. He said his favorite, Sergio Mendes in Brazil 66 had come out with an album. And the song that he and the others loved to play all the time was Wanda de Sa singing, Look Around. Look around, just look around. He said it captured it perfectly. There we were, looking out of these big portholes that Jacques had insisted on as the world of the unknown Gulf Stream passed before our eyes. And it was just magic.
Wow. And now all the years later, unfortunately, now we just have such an enormous amount of garbage in our oceans. Not only hundreds of tons floating on the surface, but much more below it. How's that been affecting your field?
We see garbage on every site we go to. I've seen plastic sippy cups and garbage on Titanic. It's bothersome because you know that whatever you're putting down there cycles through. It doesn't just stay on the bottom. It goes back into the food chain. Mm-hmm. But it also it doesn't help the marine life down there. And we are a species that fouls its own nest. That's not good. When you consider barrels full of DDT leaching into the ocean off of the California coast, or other types of waste, when you consider PCBs, when you consider just the plastic alone and what that does, when you land on a distant Pacific atoll and the seabirds are all dead, and if they've rotted enough, you look and you see that they starve to death because they're filled with plastic. When I landed on islands thousands of miles away from open shipping lanes, and there's plastic garbage all over the beach, and it just drifted on the oceans. When you think of all of that, it's unbelievable. But I mean, we've also done the same thing up there. I mean, with all the pieces of space junk orbiting around, it does have an effect. And for me, I think I don't look at it so much in terms of, well, that's an intrusive bit of the modern world on a historic or an archaeological site. What I look at is what it's doing to the overall ecosystem and what it means. The oceans are the canary in the coal mine, and they're in trouble. And we're seeing it now. We are living through this now. And if you don't think all these storms that are coming and the changing weather patterns are tied to what we've done, they are. When you consider how much fish we take that's no longer sustainable, and for what? So you can have an all-you-can-eat at a seafood restaurant? I'm sorry. It's just not the way to do it. Smart predator-prey relationships don't take 50%. And yet we will do that and more, and we will wipe stuff out. And when you hear certain countries who shall go unnamed learning that a certain type of fish is going to go away, so they go out and catch it all and freeze it to hold on as long as they can. What's with that? So what I respond to when I see what's happening to the oceans is I'm not responding as an archaeologist. I'm responding as a human being who cares about the planet, care about the future of life on the planet as a grandfather. But I also care about it as somebody who understands that this is a sensitive ecosystem and we now are affecting that. And as somebody, who has been to Titanic, I have a pretty clear sense of what happens when the ship goes down and you don't have enough lifeboats. Well, there aren't enough lifeboats for life on Earth.
Sad to say, but absolutely true. Speaking of Titanic, without including the Titanic, to you, what's the Holy Grail wreck?
We used to, I had a list. I'd like to see this, I'd like to see that. In the 5 decades I've been at this, I've been fortunate enough to see and to interact with and to touch a variety of shipwrecks that have powerful stories to tell. And the most powerful ones, the Holy Grails, aren't truly Holy Grails in terms of Cussler and I would always talk about this. Is it a story that has a great, is it a wreck that has a great story? Not always, because most wrecks can have a pretty cool story, whether it's a good news or a bad news day for those people on that ship. It's not necessarily how old it is. It's not how magnificent the finds are. Not every wreck's King Tut's tomb. The ones that for me are the ones to be found are the ones that speak to what I think of the reality of life at sea is. Excuse me. This is the time of day when having a cat and being allergic to him sort of collide.
I've been there.
So we were working on a project when I was at NOAA off the coast of the Carolinas, and at Blake Ridge, we came across a wreck that our colleagues at Woods Hole had found and that we were hoping to see with a follow-up mission with the robotics. Small craft, and we still don't know the name. I estimated from what we could see in it, largely consumed. Just metal fasteners and some traces of wood. A pile of bricks, some very corroded iron from a cook pot, a few other artifacts. Small 2-masted vessel, probably 1840s, roughly. Tiny working boat. And what you could see is navigational instruments were there, including one guy's pipe and a little packet of buttons and needles and thread, known in the maritime world back then as the sailor's wife, because he had to mend his own clothes and put his own buttons on. Nobody made it off this ship. It's hundreds of miles off the coast in a position that suggested it got caught in a storm. They let the anchor out perhaps and tried to drag a sea anchor. Maybe they cut the anchor loose and just had a sail at the end to try to slow her down and to keep her from going off, but down it went. And you realize when you look at that for years afterwards, there was a family wondering, or families, what happened? Where were they? And in that, for me, that's where it comes back to why I'm an archaeologist. It's people, and it's understanding people and human stories and being reminded of these. This was a perfect storm without an author to write about it and to humanize and to introduce us all to Billy Tyne and the rest of his crew. And therein it is. I mean, there's so many people that have always made their living out there on the water. Like the Coast Guard or others, you have to go out, but you don't necessarily get to come back. Mm. And when you consider the number of wrecks and the number of lives lost, it's generally people in merchant service. It's fishing, it's tugboating, it's deep seas work. And when those stories come to the fore, when we hear about it, we remember it, but it's different in a way than if you were to look at a liner full of people and suddenly 1,500 are dead with Titanic. Not every wreck's a Titanic. Not every wreck is a warship that's gone down with all hands fighting. But to argue that those ships are more significant than a two-masted brig that went down and took 4 to 5 men whose families often wondered, and one of hundreds, if not thousands, of ships like that that would go missing, as well as what they did and where they connected to and what the roles there were that they played in their lives. That's it. I mean, so it's not the big and the powerful or the strong on the stage. It's the everyday person. So for me, those are the holy grails, as well as ships that have unfortunate, terrible stories that need to be told, that the wreck gives you tangible physical connection to and evidence of crime, as is the case with the slave ship Clotilda that we've been working on. Last ship known to have brought captives from Africa to be forcibly enslaved in the United States in July 1860. And a descendant community that knows the story, but would always encounter people in town who would say, well, prove it.
Yes.
Laughing even at the time in the face of an illegal slave trade, that a voyage could be done under the nose of federal officials and nobody'd go to jail for a crime that officially could bring the death penalty or engaging in the illegal slave trade. And yet here's this ship sitting in the mud, in the brackish water of the Mobile River. And as we've worked on it, I mean, the slave hold is intact. Wow. And you just suddenly, it's not just a history book. You are confronting the reality of a horrific situation in which 110 people are packed into a ship's hold, not much bigger than the office that I'm speaking to you from, for 40 days. Peeing on each other, vomiting on each other, bleeding on each other, crying, and locked away in the dark as a few of them die. And wondering what's going to happen, and then suddenly being landed in the dark, naked, afraid, because they stripped them before they threw them into the hold, and then yelled at in strange language and divided up and never to see your home or your family again. And we know more of that experience because some of them told their stories in the aftermath of the war. I mean, they landed in 1860. 1865, the war is over. The Emancipation Proclamation happens. And we have a few accounts. Plus, they told their children and their children's children, and the children of those children's children now are there with us. That's a powerful wreck. It was on quote unquote a list, but it was probably one of the more profound experiences I've had as a maritime archaeologist has been working on Clotilda.
Wow, what a powerful story.
Yeah.
Now, one story that caught my attention was the Exodus.
Good old Moby Dick, yes, the Essex.
Yes.
Well, and again, I mean, there's some powerful stories to be told with that. I was actually just looking at images of another whaling wreck in the deep, deep ocean and what that looks like after time. It's almost like the X-ray of a whaling ship. Wood's gone, but all the metal's there, including the huge whaling pots in which they would strip the flesh off that whale and boil it down into the oil. Essex is well known because, of course, this is one of the occasions where a whale rams and sinks the ship. And it is, of course, Owen Chase who's on that ship, who survives not only that shipwreck, but drifting in an open boat in which the men eating one another to live. He comes back and he passes his story on, and ultimately Melville writes it as Moby Dick. That is a powerful story. For me, it was interesting with my colleagues in NOAA to have archaeologists Kelly Gleason and Hans von Tilburg and the others working on the wreck of the Two Brothers, which was the ship given to the captain of the Essex to command after he was rescued and brought home. And up in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, still in pursuit of Leviathan, hunting for whales, she strikes the reef and wrecks. They had to carry the poor captain, George Pollard, off. No, not again. He could just, but unfortunately other ships were there and rescued them within a day. But in that, yes, lightning struck twice. But for me, it's not just the story of floating factories and of hunting the whale in a Nantucket sleigh ride, or waiting until his furnace blows red as blood reaches the whale's lungs as you lance him. It's the fact that this is America's first great ocean industry. And we wage such a terrible war against the whale that we nearly wipe them out. Mm-hmm. And keep going at it, even though by 1849, we've already reached peak oil. And that's exactly what it was. I mean, no more could be produced, and it was only going to go down. And so you start going for different types of whales. You keep expending time and money and resources to get more ships out and to go into different areas until finally it's like, okay, we can't do this any further. And so what do we do then? Okay, a number of those guys like the Rockefellers and others who had invested in whaling, they now turn their attention to this new technology and to petroleum and become the oil moguls, from whale oil to oil. So in that, again, with what I study, I'm looking at repetitive parts of human history and what ships or wrecks or sites do to tell us about that and to make that a little more tangible and real, but also to provide details that aren't always written down. So yes, I mean, Essex is well known because of Moby Dick, but its story is far more than Owen Chase's account of George Pollard's terrible choice in having to kill a family member to eat the boy after he'd promised his mother he'd look after him, and so on. I mean, so again,
was that wreck ever found?
No, it's deep somewhere off of the Galapagos. One of these days, when if we continue to survey and map, one of these days somebody's going to spot something, and because we know what certain things look like on the bottom, somebody say, "Is that a tripod?" Yes, that big kettle, that's a tripod. Okay, well, let's go drop a camera and take a look at the position and say, well, I wonder if this is the Essex. Could happen. The big Museum of the Sea still has stories to tell, and a vault that remains largely unexplored.
I'm sure you've had many close calls. How difficult and dangerous is underwater archaeology?
It's about as dangerous as stupid can be at times. I've had a couple of close calls, generally earlier career ones, when I hadn't particularly listened well to Master Sergeant Bowen, who said, there are old divers and there are bold divers. There are no old, bold divers.
Oh.
Yes, Sergeant. Anyway, he was right. A couple times, a little too bold, a little too sure of myself as a diver. You can get into trouble. The ocean is unforgiving.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, I was trained. There have been close calls, and from all of those, thankfully, I've learned. Mm-hmm. So never turn your back on the sea. Always respect the sea. And sometimes when your time comes, it comes. And I feel for those guys safe on that brig, because we were on a project and heading across the Pacific, and the ship we were on had been limping along on one engine, and then in the midst of this storm, both engines died, and we took a list, and we drifted helpless for a day into the night, maybe longer. Time just goes away. And we were all strapped into our bunks as the engineers worked in a dead ship in the tropics, close to the equator, lashed by this storm, throwing up as their world in the darkness was topsy-turvy with flashlights to get those engines working again and for us to limp into port. So, there's moments like that, though you realize when your time comes, it comes. But I remember, if you haven't figured it out, I'm a big fan of music. Mm-hmm. So there was this one line from Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and it made sense. It's just a line until you live through it. And that was, does anyone know where the love of God goes when the waves turn the minutes to hours? Been there. Yeah.
Now, when you're searching for a wreck, to you, what is more important, photographic data or sonar data?
You always need a picture. It's not exploration if you don't come home and have the ability to share, right? Mm-hmm. So sonar data, it's important, and we try to get it all. But basically, the point is we try to go with as much instrumentation as possible to gather as much information as we can. Mm-hmm. More often than not, you're not always mounting an expedition that's intention is to just seek out and explore. You can do a survey and map in which things come about as you look at the data. But on a number of these things, we just try to bring as much instrumentation as possible. But in that, just to segue off of your question, comes back to what I was talking about earlier. With the robotics, you're getting dissolved oxygen, you're getting temperature readings, you're looking at salinity. You have biologists there looking at the live feed. And as you say, I'd like to look at that bottle. They say, I'd like to look at that anemone. And you share your time.
Yeah.
Because it's important, because you're seeing things for the first time with human eyes, capturing it on video as well as data. So, and ship time can go anywhere from 35 to 75, 80,000 bucks a day. So you're doing it cost effectively. It's not as much as a mission to Mars. And it's, I think, very relevant and important, as the Mars missions are too. But you try to do it economically and get the biggest payback you can by having as many eyes and as many systems as you have on.
So with all this technology, do you have to now worry less about the pixelations?
Yeah, I mean, you still have issues when you're dealing with electronics in salt water, and that's not a marriage made in heaven.
Yeah.
So there are times when, yeah, you will have some problems, but for the most part, no. I mean, we come away with incredible data. What I'm proudest of is that with the stuff we did at NOAA, that belongs to you. It belongs to everybody out there. It's public data, and anybody can access it and use it. I like that.
Yeah.
It encourages a free exchange of ideas and learning, and doesn't just make ocean exploration something for a handful of self-appointed elite scientists, people with money.
What work did you do with Alcatraz? You a historian with Alcatraz Island?
When I started my career in the National Park Service in 1978, I was, for a while, I was the assistant to the Western region, the Park Service. I was the assistant regional historian as a college intern, but a paid intern. And then from there, I went over to Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Started at the historic ships as an interpretive ranger for a while, to wear the uniform and to do that in the Park Service. And then the archaeologist slot was filled. So I was assigned to be the first historian for the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, which had been created in October of 72. It opened Alcatraz in early 73. And by the time I got there in 78, it was still a young park and finding its way. So we were inventorying, surveying, looking for everything from prehistoric sites to old ranches from the gold rush and beyond, to traces of, the industrial history of the city, but Alcatraz as well. And so for me, going out and working with the team on Alcatraz, I mean, I know the island well. The public could land and go up and walk up and do the cell house. I've been in the tunnels underneath. We've crawled through and over everything, into every building, into rooms that had been long forgotten after the prison had been closed or hadn't been in since the occupation by the Indians of all tribes in 72, 71, excuse me. Just quite the place. But with that, this is 70s. The prison had just closed a little bit, 15 years earlier. So I got to know a certain number of correctional officers and former inmates. What's interesting is the Bureau of Prisons was unhappy with how the Park Service was interpreting Alcatraz. Some of the rangers had fallen prey to sort of the Hollywood depiction, Alcatraz, Island of Despair, America's Devil's Island. And somehow, they were interpreting Alcatraz as if the correctional officers were some sort of sadistic bunch of goons, which was not the case. You have difficult personalities on both sides of the bars at times. Yeah. But Bureau of Prisons wanted that change. So as the historian, they said, okay, you're responsible. I said, well, how do we address this? Your records are sealed. So they had me sign what today is known as an NDA. And I flew out to an archive, and there I was given full access to all of the files of Alcatraz, every inmate jacket or file, all of that. Capone's, Machine Gun Kelly's, Alvin Karpus, and so many others. The records, the administrative records, all of that. There's still some things I can't talk about, even though some individuals are gone, because I, reading those files, know exactly who ratted out whom.
Wow, that's
kind
really
of a thing.
cool.
But, and details that people just like, you don't need to know.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, you can imagine what prison life is like. And there's some things that I read about was like with murders and everything else. I mean, and so, no, but I mean, it was fascinating. And then they sent me to prison. I had a couple of opportunities escorted to go in to prison and see that, including a tour of death row at San Quentin. So I can assure you that we shifted to a more balanced and nuanced interpretation on Alcatraz. But I'd had the benefit of getting a crash course, sort of, master's degree level course in penology and in history of penitentiaries and seeing what it was like. And yeah, it was quite the place. But Alcatraz, still, I mean, I think many of my colleagues who know me as a ship guy don't know about that earlier history or the Civil War day, prehistoric work and digging up, sites, things of that, from 3,000 years ago in California, entire burial grounds in advance of construction, tearing everything out. Alcatraz is the one where people always go, or the fact that I wrote the guidebook to Alcatraz, which was sort of fun as well. So yes, Alcatraz, fascinating place and a reminder for me early on in my career of how you can take a place that has become an icon, and that can have negative and positive connotations. But I mean, for me in my career, Alcatraz was the start of dealing with big issue stories that have complexity and difficult aspects to them, whether it's loss of life or an unpleasant aspect of history or you name it. So, I mean, think about it. I went from Alcatraz to working with Pearl Harbor and the ships sunk on December 7th, to working on the ship sunk with the atomic bomb tests at Bikini in 1946, to a Nazi concentration camp in the mountains, to Titanic, which has all of its baggage, no pun intended. And now, the last ship known to have brought slaves to America. All of these places have important, powerful images and reputations. How you approach them, how you share that history, how you interpret that history, how you continue to dig and poke at that history is fascinating, particularly when you are grappling with something that people are going to interpret differently.
Wow, man, you've done it all, pal. It's amazing.
I don't know if I've
You have
done
time
it.
to eat?
Well, the best part of exploration, of course, is that when you're out there, I don't just study the dead, nor do I always make a point of studying the living, but I've enjoyed travel, seeing the world, like 100 countries now. It's people, it's friends in other countries, it's learning other languages, at least survival, this or that, or in my case, being, conversant in Spanish. Living in another country for 20 years, as I did as well, it changes your perceptions, it changes your perspectives, it changes you. And so with that, I mean, I've always been passionate about getting out there and seeing these places. So I listen to the music, I'll eat the food, I'll dance the dance, I will enter into that life and see it for what it's worth. On the coast of Portugal, it's driving into a little town to figure out, just which is the best cheese that they make fresh from the goat or the sheep, and then get caught up in a funeral and join everybody as the coffin is carried to the graveyard, and then everybody sits down and sings and dances and eats, and you are at a table with a family that have invited you. Or being up in the Arctic as an Inuktitut hunter who has just shot a seal to feed the orphans in this tiny community. On the rocks, slits that seal open as a little boy is watching, as he's teaching him how to do this. And he's there and he knows, and I've done this a time or two, offers you the opportunity to take a slice of still warm liver that he's just cut out of that animal on his knife, and you do not insult him. You take that and you eat that. So those types of experiences, yes, that's the fun of it. And so, yeah, no, and no matter where I go, I've got to check out what's to eat, what's to drink. There's an entire subject in archaeology that's always fascinated me, is our ingenuity in creating different alcoholic beverages. There was a science fiction story I read once where the guy said, I don't know about all the rest of your technology, but human inventiveness in making intoxicants is absolutely amazing. It's starting out with the California gold rush, where everybody came and drank. First dig we did, I remember opening up this area where this fire had burned and the ship had burned. And somebody said, my God, what's that smell? And I said, that's a smell you're not going to get unless you go to a frat house after a big party and it's been 2 or 3 days and all of the spilled booze and the broken bottle booze has begun to rot. Mm-hmm. It's like, oh. And that's, you could smell the fire on May 4th, 1851, and all the spoiled booze. We peeled back that mud that had sealed it in September of 2001 in downtown San Francisco. And in that, then researching it and realizing they were bringing small lots of Chardonnay from little vineyards in France. They were bringing a pajarete, which is a sweet red wine from Chile. They were bringing arak, rice brandy from Indonesia. You name it, they had it. With lots of Tennant's ale, which they still make, as well as some other some great drinks, all there in this grand emporium that the California Gold Rush had created due to the buying power of gold. And in the midst of all that, to go down and see a little sliver of wood and pick it up, and it's the top of a cigar box with the Fabrica of a little place in Havana.
That's great.
So yes, as Hinton Helper would say, he was a minister who hated California. He said, California has the prettiest courtesans, the sharpest knives, the shootingest guns, the strongest drinks, the cursingest mouths, so on and so forth. He'll say this of California: it has the best of the worst things in life, all because of gold.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. Now, aside from all the boots on the ground things that you've done, or boat on the water things, you've held some pretty lofty positions. For instance, Senior VP of Search, President CEO of Institution of Nautical Archaeology. Now, with that position, how much does that help you to get done what you want to do? But at the same time, what percentage of that is politics that just stop you from getting done what you want to do?
Well, I've been fortunate to have some jobs where I joined because I believe in public service. I believe in giving back wherever possible. At the museum, running the museum was an opportunity to enact policies that let certain groups in for free, that had outreach programs for kids at risk, long before it became fashionable. Things of that sort. But also when you're in charge and you approach it to what I think is the right way, you realize you're not in charge, you just have the responsibility of carrying it forward. And that responsibility comes with the benefit of having a good team that you can rely on and work with. And so my job more often than not was to plow the road, to get the obstacles out of the way, to get the resources, and to work with some amazing people on those teams. And I've been fortunate at every step with every one of those jobs. But there's times I miss being the, just the park historian.
Right.
With else to worry about all the big stuff and just going out there and exploring, and the world seemed young. But I like the ability to be able to step in some of these places and say, no, we're going to do the right thing. Making sure that with the Institute that we moved out of a colonial model or mindset. We're in Turkey and we're happy to have Turks join us on the projects, to empowering and working so that the resources that had come from America were there for the Turks themselves. I remember the day I said, I want the name over the front door in English replaced. So it went from Institute of Nautical Archaeology to Solte Archeologie Institutus, as it should, you know. So the moments like that, to certain things, in the government, having the ability to see that the right thing is done, to work with colleagues to get two guys sitting on a lab shelf buried at Arlington, a century and a half after they drowned on the Monitor, to finding a tugboat, going back, working with genealogists, and being able to call families who for close to a century had wondered what had happened, and say, we found your grandfather's boat, we found your great uncle's boat. And to have these families who still lived with the echo of those traumas, families forever changed, to be able to say, yes, here they are, and to be able to have closure with a ship that had gone missing, never to be found. It's one of the great mysteries, the USS Conestoga. And to be able to do that, or to be able to call, being the government official who got asked during the war, I just backtracked, during the war, the Weather Service, now part of NOAA, provided weather observers on Coast Guard ships in the Battle of the Atlantic. You had convoys through, and you wanted to do it at a time when the weather was bad for the German planes and bad for the U-boats, but the ships could get through. Weather was important in the Battle of the Atlantic, and both sides did what they could, not only to plot weather, but to take out the others' weather stations. Sinking weather ships would be a priority, as well as destroying German weather stations landed on the Arctic coast. In the case of this one ship, Coast Guard cutter, was torpedoed and sunk, and all hands went down. The Coast Guard crew all got the Purple Heart, but at that stage, civilians wouldn't, and the Weather Service had these four guys on board. Anyway, Coast Guard historians were doing a review, and they saw the weatherman, and they called and they said, so NOAA, and I was the Director of Maritime Heritage, they said, your call, what do you think about the Purple Heart for these guys? I said, it's the right thing to do. Absolutely. I said, I'll pass word on to the administrator, Dr. Sullivan. I can't see Kathy as a Navy person saying no to this. I don't need to ask for permission. Yes, let's do this. And they said, okay, we don't have the resources to track down family, but we had a volunteer genealogist, and Lisa Stansbury got to work. And so the next thing you know, you're on a phone and you're talking to somebody. And the families at first, it's just a hoax. And then, no, really calling from the government, we've done this and we want to honor your great uncle. The last call, it was the dead weatherman's brother. Wow. Up in years, and the most profound experience, because the years stripped away, as he told me about answering the door the day that his immigrant parents, who did not speak English, had him answer the door. And there was a telegram from Western Union. And he had to read it to his father, who collapsed, saying that his brother, who with bad eyes and tried to join the Navy, couldn't join the Weather Service and had been killed. And to hear this from him, and then for him to ask me as a government official a question that family probably had for decades, which was, did my brother make a difference? And to be able to say, yes, absolutely. I wasn't there. I was born afterwards, and I enjoy the freedoms that your brother and others laid their lives down on that altar to pay for. But without those weather ships, without them doing their work, without those convoys, the troops, the bullets, the vehicles, everything needed to defeat the Nazis in Europe would not have come over. So yes, he made a difference. And then to stand there as our admirals on the day we had that ceremony, and the families were all receiving the Purple Hearts, and that gentleman stood up in his wheelchair, and the admirals pinned his brother's Purple Heart on his jacket. It's just like that's why you go into public service, among other reasons. Yeah. So it's not in that the jobs give you an opportunity to have, a big title or anything of that sort. There's no such thing as power. The concept of power is arcane and strange anyway. If you have an ability to channel things in a direction, people sometimes think that's power. The appropriate way to do it is to do it carrying it forward, to empower others and to do it for the right reasons and not for yourself. And so that's been where it's been at for me in my public career. These days, working in the nonprofit world, I guess I've had the benefit of being an academic, a government person, a nonprofit person, and now a for-profit, corporate person. And I like to think that each one of those experiences has put me in the position I'm at now, which is very humbly, you realize how little you know. And you have to draw not only on these various experiences, no one of them alone can get you to the place you might need to go with an answer, but also the understanding that throughout all of that, it ultimately comes down again to what drew me to archaeology in the first place, and that's people. You're only good as the people that are there to catch you when you fall, to lend a hand, for you to help, and to also, be there to catch them if they fall, to give them a helping hand, and to, whenever appropriate, just remind them that their presence, their contributions mean so very much. In this past year, I've lost a lot of friends, none to COVID, but many friends. And it just reminds you, again, of the most precious thing in life, which is not places you go, things you see, it's the people you meet.
Very much so. So what's next for you?
Oh, there's always a list of projects, and there's a number of things that we're working on now, some of which I'm sure you'll be hearing about in the next little bit. Sometimes they don't always happen, and that's part of the fun. At 63, still young, but old enough to know better. I know that many discussions won't go in certain places. I mean, I wouldn't have thought that COVID would have had such a profound impact on so much of what I and so others have done. And so there's a number of projects that didn't happen and might not. But more important than that is, this last year actually told me that it's not looking forward to new projects or discoveries or finds. It has been circling back and connecting with people. And that's been the best, actually. I've stayed home for a year, and better than a year, with my wife. She's now retired. So while it's been difficult, we've seen the positive part of that. I think the cat, who certainly is enjoying having his people home, has also benefited from all of this. But kidding aside about the cat having two shuttles living with him, it's been reaching out and connecting with people and having the time to, as well as the renewed sense of how fragile life is and how quickly things can turn and change. And you think you're in control. And then the universe comes along and says, no.
Well, Jim, thank you so much for talking to me. You're absolutely captivating to talk to. I could sit here for days and talk to you. So thank you so much for your time. And
thank you, Rusty.
I'll definitely be watching you and Whenever I see anything new coming up, I'll be emailing you for a little bit more time if you don't mind, because I love your direction.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a real honor. I really appreciate being reached out to and being asked to join what seems to me to be a really profound group of conversations you're having. So thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. Hey, listen, you have a fantastic
Keep doing what you're doing.
Thanks, pal. You too. I appreciate it so much, Jim.
Thank you.
Have a
Take
great
care.
day. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye-bye.
A Da Vinci Life.